Hello and welcome to another episode of the DigiTeacher. This week I'm delighted to be talking to Nicky Lacey. She runs a website, she creates content, she creates resources for teaching of computing, fantastic resources. I put the link in the description below. Please visit the site and have a look at the resources, it's well worth it, and listen to the conversation that we had about all things computing education. So, hi everybody. I'm talking to Nicky Lacey, who's very kindly agreed to put up with an interview from me, and I'm going to just ask her to tell us about her journey and how she got here.
Okay, yeah, it's quite a convoluted journey, so I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. Many years ago, I used to be a programmer, so I was actually working in industry as a programmer. And then I retrained and became a teacher and loved it. And I was teaching in UK schools, mainly secondary, but I did a bit of A level. So that's 11 to 18-year-olds in the UK. And so I was teaching there and then became head of department in a private boys' school, which meant we didn't have to teach the national curriculum in the UK. So I could bring in more programming. At the time, we didn't have programming in the UK. So I could teach programming and figure out how to teach programming to these boys, and had a lot of misses and a few hits. So I worked out what worked and what didn't work, and then the UK government came in and said, we're changing from more IT to computer science, bringing in programming. So all my teacher friends were panicking because they had no programming experience. And then I happened to be in a nasty snowboarding accident, broke my back, so I was out of the classroom for ever, it turned out. And so I started my business, which is Nicola Wilkin Limited, and we created resources so teachers could start teaching programming, because I'd worked out how to do it in a sort of rough way at that time. And then I also got lots of opportunities. I managed to write some books, which have surprised me, but they've gone down quite well. And I've also worked for Cambridge University Press and Assessment as the assessment manager for IT for IGCSE, which is I was the nasty person who would come up with grade boundaries and decide what was in the papers. So sorry about that. And then
Someone had to.
I know. Oh, it was a horrible job. Because you knew you were making these decisions on kids' lives by just changing it by 1%, and it's really tough. Anyway, and then I'm also a reviewer for the Open National Academy, which is the UK Department of Education coming up with resources. And so I'm the only reviewer for all of their new computing resources for the UK. So I'm kind of doing that, and I'm running my business, and I've decided that's not enough on my plate. So I've also decided to try and attempt to change how we teach programming in the UK and hopefully wider afield as well. So I'm quite a busy person at the moment.
That is a hell of a CV. Very impressive. And from what I've seen of your resources, I mean, they are fantastic.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
I must admit I haven't read the books. I didn't know about the books, but I will I will try and get to that. What made you decide to go into the classroom? I mean, to leave industry, and what prompted
Um,
that?
Well, actually, we were creating software, strangely, to teach MVQ hairdressing was one of the. So we were creating the software, and we part of the role we had to go around the UK and teach the teachers how to use the new software that we developed. And I really enjoyed the teaching side, and so I then went into IT training. So I went into corporate IT training and was training like De Beers and Denton Hall and some large internationals. And I thought, yeah, it's nice, but it was an awful lot of travel. And I had young children at the time. So I thought, okay, I'll still do the teaching, but I'll retrain and become a teacher, mistakenly thinking that I'd have like summer holidays and school holidays free. obviously completely wrong about that. But yeah, so I then went into teaching and I absolutely loved it. And I would still be doing it if it wasn't for thinking I could snowboard when I clearly can't snowboard.
It sounds horrific.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, you talk about your method for teaching programming. I mean, what are some of the problems that face teachers of programming?
Well, I think there's several things that we're doing wrong. When programming first started coming in as a subject, then I think people who weren't in the know assumed if you're an ICT teacher, you could teach programming because it's using a computer. And you wouldn't expect an art teacher to be brilliant at teaching maths because they both use a pencil. It's not the same subject at all. You might use the same tools, but it's not the same subject. So all the ICT teachers who are probably brilliant at all the ICT skills, programming in particular is a completely different skill set. So in computer science, you've got the two sides, I think, of you've got the sort of theory side, like networks and security and all that stuff. And then you've got programming, which is a really different way to teach. It's not taught in the same way, I don't think, because you need to get a load of soft skills across. And I think that's where the problem is, that teachers are given the brief that you're going to be teaching programming, but they were never taught how to teach programming. And so the pedagogy was a bit all over the place. People were trying all different things. And I don't know if you're familiar with Sue Sentence, very big figure in the UK. And she came up with this idea of PRIM, which was a pedagogy which was great when it first started, and it gave people a structure. And I think that was okay. However, I love Sue and I've met Sue and I think Sue's brilliant, but her background was teaching slightly older people. It was more university students and people that had chosen computer science as a subject rather than a year 8 class on a rainy Friday afternoon who've just had PE and are climbing the walls a little bit, which are a different set of people.
I mean, that
than the
raises
ones
the
who
whole
chose it.
question. That raises the whole question: should we be teaching everybody to code?
I think basic coding, yes. I think what we're trying to do in the UK at the moment, and I'm not sure if it's the same where you are, but we're trying to teach them too much, and I don't think we need to go into quite so much detail, and they're getting cognitive overload. They're really learning too much too quickly, and they get one lesson a week, maybe a fortnight in some schools. They get 40 minutes a fortnight, and you expect them to remember. So I've seen this time and time again where teachers, they've got to think that they've got to cram in so much so quickly. And they're just kind of doing it by numbers, thinking, oh, right, I've taught them an input and a print and syntax and then how to do an if. And we've done 2 examples, so therefore they must be brilliant at it. But these students, they have 40 minutes where the teacher's probably talking for a good 20 minutes or so. They might have a go at 1 or 2 in that lesson. And then they go home, their mum yells at them because they're not tied to their room, they're excited about what they're doing at the weekend, they want to watch whatever they're watching on YouTube at that time or play whatever game it is. Then they're also learning geography and history and French and PE and maths and having all this homework and every scouts going on in the evening or swimming club or whatever. And then we're expecting them to come back after 2 weeks and remember why there's a bracket or a speech mark or a comma or something like that. It's too much. We can't possibly expect them to remember that. When they're learning maths, they take weeks and weeks and weeks doing just addition, whereas we think, oh, right, we'll do an input and a nested if and a whatever in just a few short lessons, and it's too much. So I think programming is a really good skill. It's a problem-solving, collaborative way of learning things, and I think it's needed for this new world that's coming that none of us really understand. But we need to take time to get the basics right and not just dive in and tell them about subroutines and things like that when they probably won't need that level, but they need to have an idea about how a computer thinks or how they can solve a problem. And I think that's where we're missing the mark at the moment. We're trying to teach too much syntax and odd little bits which are nice to know. And if they want to know that, then they'll go and learn it. We know those kids who will go and learn that themselves. But the one who just wants to become a nail technician, she doesn't necessarily need to know how to write a nested if statement. She wants to just get an idea of, okay, you get this input and you get that output, because at some point she's going to have to create her accounts or whatever it happens to be. So I think we're going into too much techie detail when we should be looking at soft skills more.
Yeah.
This is my ranty bit about it, but I feel quite passionate about that. Sorry.
No, I can hear that, and I agree with you. And I mean, you talk about this move away from teaching ICTs to now teaching computer science, more of the
Yeah.
programming. Has something been lost along the way there as well? I mean, shouldn't everybody also have exposure to general ICT skills?
Yeah, I do. I do think that. I think we need to find that happy medium. They do need to know about cybersecurity. They do need to know about e-safety. They do need to know maybe spreadsheets or how to create a PowerPoint presentation properly, so they're not just doing it for everything and trying to create their reports in a PowerPoint, which I've seen kids do. Or they know how to use basic skills, but I think this computational thinking is quite a useful skill for this new world we're trying to set them up for, where we don't know what jobs they're going to be doing. 15 years ago when I was teaching, there was no influencers. We weren't setting up for jobs to become an influencer, but now they can make millions doing it. And so whatever the world is coming, we need to get them the soft skills to do that, whatever that happens to be. And I think focusing too much on the nuances isn't necessarily the way to go. We need to make sure they've got the basics, but then they can fly with it and experiment themselves, and they have the confidence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you mean by soft skills? Do you mean in the context of computational thinking, more kind of unplugged rather than a particular syntax or?
Not necessarily unplugged. I mean, you can do unplugged because that's useful as well. But I think more like being able to decompose a problem or look for patterns, or just how to work collaboratively with other people. I mean, that's a skill which they're going to need in the workplace. And I don't think we teach it explicitly enough.
We don't.
And problem solving and just resilience as well. When things go wrong, how you figure it out yourself rather than put your hands up and wait for someone to tell you the answer. Those are the soft skills that I think they need to be learning, rather than how to write an if statement, which is useful but not as important in the long run.
Could ChatGPT write you an if statement? I mean,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, ChatGPT, it does that sort of thing. So I think they need to be told how to use AI and these large language models, to how to use them safely. And I think the issue we have, certainly in the UK, is security. We don't know where the data is being stored, and so a lot of schools don't want to expose the students to putting things in where they might answer stuff and we don't know how that's being stored. And so I can understand why a lot of schools are reluctant at the moment to teach AI and include that. But it's something that, it's a tool, it's around, they're going to have to use it. So you may as well teach them how to use it safely. And so I think, yeah, knowing how to research something, I mean, when I was at school, we were taught how to use index cards in the library to go and research stuff. Whereas I don't think that's something they're going to be doing so much these days. Whereas knowing how to Google something and look at it to see if it's bias is useful. But I think AI, we need to do the same thing. They've been taught how to use Google in the classroom, but knowing how to use something like ChatGPT is also a useful tool. They need to be told how to use it and how to look at it and decide if it is real, the data that it's telling you, because we know that there's bias creeping in there as well, and how to use decent prompts for it, which I'm still learning. Sometimes I put something in and I think that wasn't what I was looking for at all. Never
Yeah,
mind.
me too. Me too. I mean, when I was in high school, I deliberately decided not to go into computing, and one of the reasons were they were predicting that there would be very little need for programmers because artificial intelligence would arrive, and then there wouldn't be a need for programmers. So I only took it up as a hobby. Um, uh, I mean, do you think that's still the case with the rise of AI that we shouldn't actually be teaching them to program at all? Or what's your feeling around that?
I think there's still a need for programming, but I think the emphasis needs to be more on the soft skills coming up and
Yeah,
working out how they can solve problems really. Because even though AI can write the code, it's a bit like driving a car. My son at the moment, I'm teaching him how to drive a car. So this is obviously on the forefront of my mind. He's got his test in a few days. So we're
fingers
thinking
crossed for him.
about, yeah, yes. Oh my goodness. And so we're thinking about driving a car, and he's learning in a manual car because he wants to take the test in a manual car. But then I'm thinking, well, in 5 years' time, would you be able to buy a manual car? Aren't there going to be a lot of self-driving, certainly electric, and they're not manual. Electric, you can't buy an electric manual car, that as far as I know. So you kind of wonder if that's a problem. But then that's giving him things like clutch control. The other day I was telling him how to accelerate up a hill, so dropping down again. I'm not entirely sure I'm the best person to teach him how to drive, thinking about it. But anyway, I think it does give you a better idea if you know these things. But I think sometimes we're just adding to the load, for the cognitive load of our students. We're just adding to it. I was thinking, when I was preparing for this interview, I was thinking about what's redundant that we're still teaching. And I know what's coming up in the Cambridge University Press exams because I was there when we wrote them. And so, not that I'm giving anything away, but they still ask things like, what's the difference in capacity between a floppy disk and a CD? But really, that's not relevant technology now. I don't know why we're still banging on about CDs and floppy disks. It's nice in a history lesson, maybe in a history of computing, but I don't know if it's really useful to know the capacity these days of a floppy disk because you can't even plug one in anywhere.
Yeah. Even CDs. I mean,
Yeah. So they're still talking about really old stuff that you think, well, that could go. We can get rid of that. We can get rid of, the example I saw, and someone sent me some resources the other day to check. And they were using the example for a database of a video rental shop. And I thought, who has a video rental shop these days? Why would you why would you even think about that? Or teachers writing lessons on Facebook, and you're like, no young person is using Facebook these days. That's something their mums use. That's why they don't use it.
yeah,
So I think we need to update and get rid of a load of stuff because we're just adding to it and we're not actually getting rid of anything. And that was something the other day. Someone wrote a lesson on how to do a mail merge in Word, which is a useful skill, but they were doing it for a letter. No one posts letters now.
yeah,
We can't
yeah,
afford the stamps anymore.
yeah. Well,
So
and I'm in South Africa, and there's barely any kind of postal delivery service left. Um,
no,
yeah,
but we're
but
still
it would
teaching
be
these
useful.
things.
Yeah, but a mail merge would be useful for email, maybe. Except
Yeah,
who uses email?
update it.
Yeah,
Yeah, so update it and use a relevant example. But I think we're just sort of sometimes not helping ourselves really.
yeah.
And it's just like really frustrating.
Generational bias.
I know. But there you go.
So,
One thing for my mission.
so when you were in the classroom, what did you find kids found the hardest about learning to program?
um, I think understanding the logic. I think sometimes I rushed through the logic and I explained it in the way that I could see it. Um, we are looking at it when we're learning programming these days. We're looking at it from an adult's point of view with all our references that we can understand and think about and look back on, and we then tend to teach it the way that we like to learn it. Um, and I think that's a problem, because when we're trying to then teach it to 11-year-olds, they're not got all those same life experiences that we're looking back on. And so I think sometimes we need to look at it in their point of view, so that the logic seemed to be something that they had the most problem with. And so I learnt since that we really need to slow down and spend an awful lot longer looking at the nuances of the programming. So in the way I used to teach my first lesson of Python, it used to be that we would cover input and print and a bit of syntax errors, because they're going to get some. And because we're doing input, you need to save it as a variable. So you need to assign a variable, name a variable, all those sort of things. And that's a lot to cover for an 11-year-old or 12-year-old or however age you're doing it. There's a lot to cover about why you've got double speech marks, and some people might prefer single speech marks, and using brackets and using commas, and that's an awful lot to bring in, and that's a cognitive load which it doesn't transfer from their working memory into their long-term memory if they are getting overloaded. There's a whole thing about cognitive load theory. And so we need to slow it down. So now in my lessons I only teach input. Sorry, I don't do input. I do print statements, and we look at print statements in a lot more detail. So we look at what strings are, and we look at the syntax for just a print with a string. And it might seem like it's really boring, but we get into it just on just that first lesson, doing prints with strings. Don't do input, don't do variables or anything like that. And then we look at it and we experiment with it, and we look at using 2 speech marks and 1 speech mark, or leaving a speech mark off and using a capital P, and all the things that they could possibly do wrong. So when they do that wrong, as we all do at some point, then they know what to expect. And they create loads and loads of them in that first lesson. And then the second lesson, we start having a look at input and syntax, and then the print. And so I've slowed it right down now. And I even though I've been out of my classroom for a long time, I have worked in some schools. I was working in a private school in Cambridge not long ago, and so I've been giving these lessons to other teachers who've been experimenting as well. So it does seem that those students, then when they can get the time and we slow it down, then when they come back to it in 2 or 3 weeks' time, they're more likely to remember it. It's sunk into their long-term memory a lot better. So slowing it right down, we've got 12 lessons now, which by the end of the 12 lessons, all we've covered is input, print, syntax errors, sequence, if statements, and that includes elif and nested if as well, for loop, while loop. So that's it. That's 12 lessons to cover that, which is about a term and a bit, depends how long the terms are. But that's all we've covered, whereas traditionally what people have tried to do in 12 lessons is going right up to including lists and random numbers and subroutines and things like that. And it just doesn't work. Students don't remember it. We may as well spend the time teaching it right in the first place so they learn it, rather than having to go and reteach it 2 weeks later when you've taught it and you think that went well, everyone remembered it, and you come back to it and someone says, how do you do an if statement? And you're like, oh, we've done this, but I'm having to reteach it, but I'm only having to reteach to half the class because some of them have got it and some of them haven't, which is just really frustrating as a teacher. I may as well just do it right in the first place and slow it right down and take out all the rubbish that we don't need to teach, like subroutines. It really riles me up when people include subroutines too early. I know as a programmer subroutines are great, but a year 11 who's trying to do a print statement does not need a subroutine at that stage.
Yeah.
So
you're looking at depth rather than breadth.
Yeah, And they do so many of them that they then know when we do an input, they know about data types because they've experimented and they've looked into it in so much more detail. They know why their program's not working later on. It's sunk into that long-term memory because they've spent the time looking at all those little nuances early on rather than just doing one or two and then moving on too quick, which doesn't work.
So I noticed you've called your method jump, and
Yes.
I listened to your video on that. But would you like to explain to
Yeah.
everyone how jump works and your assessment practices? I found absolutely fascinating as well.
Yes. Yeah. Obviously, being an assessment manager, I've now got slightly obsessed with how to assess things. I don't think we're doing it right traditionally. Anyway, so jump is actually there's two parts. There's jump 1, 2, 3 is the whole thing. So jump is the pedagogy of how to teach programming, and then 1, 2, 3 is the assessment method that I've come up with. And some schools have used both jump and 1, 2, 3. Some people have just gone down jump. Some people just run 1, 2, 3. So you can do them independently. But briefly, if I can, I'm not very good at brief. Jump is the way of teaching it. So it splits up into little chapters. So instead of having one lesson, like my first lesson, which would be on just print statements and strings, then in that first lesson, I think the first chapter is looking at the difference between Scratch and Python, because it's the first text lesson they would have had. Then the next bit would have been looking at just strings, and then the next chapter would be on print with strings, and then finally creating their own print with strings. And so we've split the one lesson up into 4 chapters. And in each of those chapters, you have a semantic wave. Are you familiar with semantic waves? Yeah, it's something, yeah, I won't bang on if anyone was watching this and they were not aware of it. It's just a really good way of learning it. So each of those chapters have their own semantic wave. So you introduce the abstract concept, then you break it down, they learn it, and then they put it back together by the end of that chapter, and then you move on to the next chapter. And because each
So a semantic wave would be from introducing kind of an abstract concept and then breaking it down into something which is more, in everyday language, more understandable to the kids, and then helping the kid to repack it in more academic language or.
Yeah. So then they're applying it, or they're explaining it in their own ways, or they've then taken ownership of that abstract knowledge and they know what it means then. And so for each of those chapters, because they are quite small things that they need to learn, it's not a great big thing that they're not learning how to do input and print and syntax and variables all in one semantic wave. We're trying to do one little thing in each semantic wave. Then it's much easier to repackage that bit. So for instance, a string, then we talk to them maybe at the beginning of the wave of what a string is, and we'll say that it's got speech marks in there, and then we'll have a look at some strings, and maybe they might work in pairs to identify the strings as opposed to the integers or floating point number. Not that they know that's what the other things are called at that stage, but you'd give them a whole load of different data and they'd try and identify the strings, and then you'd talk maybe about why they would use strings, and you can use them for messages or prompts or anything like that, or just someone's name, and then they would be able to identify a string or repackage it, create a string, by just putting their name in speech marks or something. So it's quite a low semantic wave. It's not a huge amount they're trying to learn. So you can do that in 5-10 minutes if it's something quite small. And so what Jump allows you to do is think of activities that can be used to help you get that semantic wave. And you can use any of the activities in any order that you think are fit to get that wave across. So J stands for judge. So that's when you're looking at the big picture. And so they can talk in pairs about what do you think this code would do or anything like that. U is unpack, and that's when you're looking at the detail. So maybe where do you think the speech mark's going? So you're looking really at the syntax or something in a bit more detail, or on a larger program, maybe what that condition does rather than the whole program, just that one section. So judge and unpack are the theory side of it. And then M is modify, so changing a program that they've been given or their previous program they've created. And P is for program, so they're creating their own either from a flow diagram or a prompt or whatever it happens to be. So that's the modify and program are the programming practical side of it. So you've got two which look at theory, two which look at the practical side. And so you can use those however you want, depending on what it is that you were looking at in that chapter. So if, for instance, you were looking at an if statement, so something a bit more chunky than just a string, so you're introducing an if statement, then they might look at a if statement and judge what that might do or why that might not be working, for instance. You might then look at the syntax about the colon always leads to the next line being indented, in Python anyway. So how can you tell what those lines are going to be, which lines are going to be run if it meets the condition, and it's because they're indented. So you're unpacking the detail there. Then you might give them a program to modify or play about with, or whatever it happens to be. What happens when you change the condition, or even if you just run it with a different input, then what's going to happen? And then program is when they create their own. And you don't have to do them in that order. You can do your jump in any order you're around. You can jump around, you see. That's the reason I came up with jump. It was planned. So you can jump around, you can do them whatever helps you get that semantic wave. So really it's about, the pedagogy is about breaking it down into much smaller chunks and then using these different activities. So you're looking at the theory and you're looking at the programming to really help them get that semantic wave. And then you go on to the next bit. And then by the end of the lesson, then they've reached whatever the objective of that lesson is. That I can create print statements, or they can create if statements, or whatever your lesson focus happens to be on. So that's the jump part. The 1, 2, 3 is the assessment. And it's I don't know how much time we have because I do bang on with it.
I think we've got enough for the assessment. I mean,
yeah.
we've enough time to cover the assessment.
Because it seems quite weird the first time anyone hears about it, because it's very different to anything that I've seen anyone else do. But I wanted to create something which you could use no matter what the program was that they were creating. You could use the same assessment strategy. So then your mark book actually means something to me, because I hated it when I was trying to mark programs, and sometimes I was marking it out of 10, and other times it was if they could just do it or not. And then you look at your mark book over time, it's like, well, that doesn't show me progress. I don't know what that means to that student, if it actually is useful. So I wanted to create something which was consistent. So your mark book would be consistent, and then you could actually read it and get something useful out of it. That was the whole point of this. So the assessment is, there's three things. 1, 2, 3. The first one is if they've met the previous knowledge that you'd expect them to know. So if, for instance, if they were doing an if statement lesson, then before that lesson starts, I would expect my students to know about input, print, saving things with a variable name, data types for whatever the if statement has to be. So they would know that. And so I would come up with a few questions for students to peer assess each other on whether whoever they're assessing is actually knows about that previous knowledge. So one is only about previous knowledge. So I might say, have they used an input? Have they used a print statement? And have they saved it as a number, for instance, whatever the program is that I want them to do. So I get them to do peer assessment, so I don't have to assess everyone's work. I'm a very lazy person.
And it's prior knowledge, so
yeah.
I mean, they benefit as well from reviewing
exactly.
the students.
Yeah, and so by peer assessing, then they're seeing, oh, someone solved this in a different way than I seen, so that's fine. So one is if they have got that prior knowledge they should have had from before the lesson. Two is whatever the focus of the lessons is. So if the focus on the lesson is create an if statement, then have they created an if statement? That'll be the two. It doesn't have to work, but have they got the elements of the if statement in there? So have they got an if? Have they got a condition? Have they got a colon? Have they indented the lines? Is there an else if that's what I wanted to test?
Yeah.
So that's if they get two. So 1 and 2, they're just looking at the code. They're not running it at that stage. And then 3, they actually run it. And if the program works as it should, they get the 3. And if it doesn't work, they don't get the 3.
Yeah.
So that way, in my mark book.
And if they get part, I mean, you partially get the if statement, all or nothing.
Got to work or not.
Okay.
Because they would have got the mark for 1 and 2.
Yeah.
So if they got if they've done an input and a print and an if statement, they got most of it right, but it just wasn't working because they didn't use the right logic or something, then they still get 1 and 2, but the 3 is only if the program works and is fit for purpose, if it's meant to do, it does what it's supposed to do. So that's where you'd get really picky in your test, that is a greater or equal to. You'd get them to test it properly.
Yeah.
So when I look at my mark book then, and I only do that for one program per lesson. So
Right.
This is every lesson they would get a mark for one of their programs, and we choose which program it is, and everyone peer assesses someone else's work for that program. And then I take all those grades in, and they get so competitive. They get really competitive. Students are worse markers than teachers. They're so mean to each other. So you get quite an accurate mark. And if there is any questions like, I should have got a 2 for that, and you've got the questions on the board about how the mark is quite easy to settle those arguments about whether they included an if with a lowercase I is fairly obvious. So when I look at my mark book then, I can see that one student gets all 3s. Every single program they ever do is a 3. They're always getting it right. Well, I know they are actually still making progress because the program are getting harder each lesson. There's a new thing they're learning each lesson, so they're still showing progress. Or this student is getting a mixture of 2s and 3s. So yeah, they again showing progress because it's new things that they're learning. This one started off on 3s and now they're getting 2s and 1s. There's obviously some misunderstanding that's creeping in there from some previous knowledge or something they're not getting. And then I know as a teacher that I can spend a bit of time with them or stand back and watch them when they're writing that program. I can look and see maybe where they're going wrong or what they're getting stuck on, and I can jump in as the teacher. So it's actually useful for me to see the trends of whether they are maintaining, which means they're still making progress, or if they are getting better, which is lovely and getting lots of merits for that, or if they are trailing off. And I get an idea then, they're not picking up the new skills, what's happening, and I can then I can focus my attention on those students. So it's actually a more useful way of assessing rather than just saying, yeah, they got that program working. That's not enough. We need to know, have they understood the previous knowledge or the focus of the lesson? So that's what the 1, 2, 3 part is. But there's videos on my website, jump123.co.uk.
And I will put all of that in the description. And I really urge everyone to go and have a look at those videos, because I watched them and I thought, wow, what a fantastic way of assessing. And your jump method makes perfect sense to me. Just in terms of creating those semantic waves and kind of bridging that theory and practice gaps. So you've opened a lot of understanding for me about what goes into creating pedagogies for computer education. But I want to end with just one last question for you, and that is, what do you see the direction in computer education? Do we need more time in the curriculum? You've highlighted there is this huge lack of time. Is the time about right? It's just we need to improve how we do it. What do you see as the way forward?
I think, I mean, obviously, I would love to have more time, but there's so many pulls on the time
Yeah.
for education, and I certainly don't want to add more work to overstretched profession. Um, believe me. So I don't want to add more work to anyone, but I think it's going to be, if we're focusing more on soft skills, which I think is the right direction for this unknown future we're trying to prepare our students for, we need to focus on those soft skills so they've got the human side, that we know what we're doing with technology and we can understand it a bit better, and we're not afraid of it as well. So people do embrace new technology. I think that maybe needs to go more cross-curricular and maybe less dedicated to one subject, but more get it into other subjects, which does involve extra work for those other subject teachers, I'm afraid. But I think it's a skill that we do need to move towards in the future. And I think the new teachers which are being trained up, I think no matter what subject they're doing, they need to think about these skills for the future that their students are going to need. So maybe it's not going to be a dedicated subject. It might be for those kids that love it and want to become a data scientist or a robotics engineer or whatever. They want to do that in university. Well, great, and they can choose it as an option. But I do think that those computational thinking skills and those problem solving and resilience need to be in more subjects earlier on. So that's my thought.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Nicky, so much for agreeing to this interview and for bringing so much insight. And I'm sure anyone watching this will have a lot to think about. Thank you
Thank you
so
very
much.
much for the opportunity.
If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, subscribe, and please leave comments about what you've heard. And please visit Nicky's site. It's well worth it.